Greetings and welcome to today's 10-minute painting of a field of cherry blossom trees. We're going to begin here, as we generally do, in the sky with a large square-headed brush and a mixture of titanium white and primary blue pigments. We're going to continue applying this pigment until we've fully covered the sky. Then I'm going to go back to my palette, grab a good amount of titanium white, apply it to the base of our horizon, and then blend it up softly in an attempt to render a smooth gradient. If you're having an issue with this process, I would simply implore you to use a little bit of additional water in your mixtures and use a softer touch of your brush, as it should render a less streaky aesthetic. Then I'm going to grab my medium-sized square-headed brush with a mixture of Mars black and titanium white, and I'm going to begin mapping out the outskirts of my mountains. I'm using a square-headed brush because it innately has a fairly sharp edge, much like mountains, and it'll render it properly. If we were to use a round-headed brush, however, the edges would probably look a lot softer, a little bit more feathered, and you wouldn't get that gritty, rock-like effect. Now I'm going in and I'm applying the darker sides to my mountains. But how do we know which side should be darker? It's wholly dependent upon where the light source is. In this painting, the light is coming from right between our two mountains, which means everything closest to that light source, all of the surfaces that are facing that light source, they're going to be illuminated and brighter, while the opposite sides of the mountains, to the far left and far right hand side of our painting, are going to be much darker. It's also worth noting that the tops of our mountains should be much brighter than the bottoms, as more light will be able to consume and wrap around it. Here we're just adding a darker pigment to the bottom of our mountains and ensuring we are rendering some good depth. Now, I'm also applying all of these pigments on the same angle, for the most part, as the sides of the mountain. I'm doing this so we can create little pathways going up the mountain. It creates little ridges, little intricacies. It makes each mountain interesting. It gives it some motion and movement, and I think it really adds to the aesthetic of the piece. I'm then switching to a smaller square-headed brush, taking some lighter pigments, and in a zigzagging motion I'm moving down the canvas. This is creating a light pigment at the top, and then as we move farther down, the paints begin to blend. It starts to lessen in pigment, it gets darker, and we get a really nice transition from the top to the bottom. I'm also doing this with a bit of a tapping effect at the top with pure titanium white to get more of a stark, gritty looking aesthetic. If you do more of a brush stroke, it softens the pigment, it blends the pigment, and it pushes it backwards. But rocks are innately a lot harder, so if you do more of a tapping, you'll get a much more rigid effect. Now, to finish off our mountains, I'm taking some darker pigments, applying them to the left and right hand side, the sides opposite to the light, and the bottom, just ensuring we have a good amount of depth and these look fairly three-dimensional. Then I'm going to grab an old square-headed brush. This is simply a brush where the bristles leaf off in varying directions, ensuring that they kind of make a myriad of implications when you make a tapping motion, because all of the bristles leaf off in varying directions. It makes a very random aesthetic. And it's fantastic for this because in the distance, you don't see the details, you don't see all of the finite pieces of them, and it does look more like an implication. This brush renders said implication, and it does it very easily in a tapping motion. So as we're in the background, the far, far background, we're using a fairly desaturated color. It's a mixture of primary red, primary blue, and titanium white. And then as we get closer to the foreground, we incorporate more red than blue, which makes it look much more pink, and it looks much more vibrant. So we're creating depth through that as well. You generally want the background to be a little bit less saturated than the foreground. I also ensured that the background, a lot of those tapping motions kind of blended together. There weren't a lot of openings in them. Whereas here in the foreground, I'm leaving room to see those darker pigments underneath. The whole idea there is just that we want to be able to see through the trees. There are openings in the trees. All of these trees are different and interesting, and it'll just add a lot of life to the painting. Then I'm going to grab an rake brush. Now this is a really convenient brush because when you make a single stroke with it, you actually make a myriad of strokes with it. You can buy these at your local art stores such as Michael's, but you can also make your own. I made this one. I'll have a link down below in the description as to how you can make your own. And it's just such a time-efficient brush. I'm using a green here. It is a mixture of primary yellow, primary blue, Mars black, and a little bit of titanium white. I used the Mars black and titanium white to make a gray to desaturate it a little bit. I didn't want a highly vibrant, highly bright green because I didn't want it to distract from the trees and all of the really nice, beautiful paints that we're going to be rendering. That's something to keep in mind when you're doing a painting. Sometimes, maybe grass should be a hyper vibrant green, but it'll be too distracting. So we take an artistic liberty, we lessen it, and then we continue on with the painting, ensuring that the viewer's eye and the focus goes to where it really should be. Now that I have all of the grass and the background done for the most part, I'm moving on to the tree in the foreground. I'm doing so with a small, square-headed brush. I'm using a lot of water, and I'm using a mixture of burnt umber, Mars black, and titanium white. I'm using the titanium white and Mars black to desaturate it a little bit, but also to thicken the pigment. Colors like the primary colors, red, yellow, blue, and burnt umber, are innately fairly transparent, and if you were to layer on a single layer, you'd see the white from behind the canvas to a point unless you used a very thick layer. Whereas pigments like Mars black and titanium white are very opaque, they can really thicken a pigment. So it's not see-through, you don't have to do so many layers with it. It's very efficient. And you can always go back and add on more saturation after. Now, in regards to this actual tree here, you saw that I drew it on initially. I did so with a Sharpie marker, a fine tip Sharpie marker, that way I could see through the initial layers of the sky. And we could do that, of course, because, as we mentioned, acrylic paints are innately fairly transparent. If you're having an issue rendering these sharp little lines, I would simply implore you to use more water in your mixtures. It will make the whole ordeal much easier. Now, we started our tree here with a base color, and that is a fairly medium value. Now we're going to add in a darker value to the opposite side of the tree that isn't going to be receiving light. So this side of the tree, it's on the back. These portions are going to be a lot darker. Again, they are not going to be receiving the same light, and this is essentially how we're going to render depth within it. Then, on the sides that are receiving light, we are using a brighter version of that burnt umber. This is going to create a lot of depth. I'm doing a lot of this in a tapping motion. It isn't a pure stroke. I do want this to look as if it has bark. I do want it to look a little bit more crisp and fine. And we're doing this in a very similar manner to the way we did the tops of the mountains and the detail and the pressure there. So it's very much a process. We're building and building. Here we're going back and adding a little bit of additional highlights to the trees down on the bottom right-hand corner of the painting. Here I'm just using more titanium white and primary red to render a nice pink and really ensure that those areas pop and are much more vibrant and bright than the background of our painting. I'm using the old square-headed brush because, again, it renders a plethora of little markings when you use a tapping motion with it. You don't want to drag the brush in the foreground as that will soften portions. You can, however, soften portions of the background of these trees with a little bit of a dragging motion when you're beginning. Now that I've pretty much let my tree dry, and so I can go over it here with more of our foliage. I'm doing so with a fairly bright pink, and I'm doing so because I want it to be much more in the forefront and the foreground than the trees that we did in the bottom right-hand corner. I really want this area to stand out and be quite interesting. I want it to capture the viewer's attention. So I'm doing this in a tapping motion, as you can see, and I'm attempting to create varying clusters of foliage. Now, I'm leaving a lot of openings within this, And I'm occasionally going over portions of branches, but I'm not always. Sometimes I'm going to work around branches. All of these little intricacies are going to be things that really help add to the realism of your tree and make it look a lot more interesting. So just make sure that you're A, not always going over all of the branches, and B, not always avoiding the branches. You want a healthy mixture of the two. It's also important to note that your clusters of foliage here should be varying sizes. Sometimes you have a large cluster, sometimes you have a small cluster. And they should be in different shapes. Maybe pick varying geometric shapes, alter them slightly, and then apply them in that manner as well. So that is our base layer. Now I'm grabbing a little bit of a darker pigment and I'm applying this to the center areas of the foliage, or rather the back center areas. These are the areas of foliage that are too dense to allow light through them, and so we're going to build some depth through that as well. Now that is at the 10-minute mark, but I did want to show you a couple extra little things. Here I'm adding some highlights to the edges of our trees. It's a much lighter pigment, and now we have a light, a medium, and a dark value, which is fantastic. It is just like what we did in the tree, and that is essentially how you incorporate depth within your piece. Now, just to balance it out, for those of us who are kind of maximists, we don't like the minimalist look as much, I'm throwing a second tree over here on the far left, or rather far right hand side of the canvas. I'm starting with my darker pigments. Then I go in and I add a bit of our lighter pigments to the edge. Again, it's wherever the light will be hitting it, and a good gauge to understand that is again in our mountains. So there, I'm just softening it a little bit, and then I go in and incorporate a couple of branches. I weave it in and out of our foliage, and I ensure that they are nice and small. I do this with a good amount of water and with my smaller square-headed brush. But anyways, there is essentially our 10 to 13-ish minute painting. I know we cheated again, but I had a couple of extra ideas and I was sure you'd want to see them as well. So with that said, if you are new to acrylic painting and you'd simply like to learn more, there is a link in the description to my ebook, Acrylics for Beginners. If you'd like to do longer lessons, if you'd like to see the color palettes and all of that, there is a link in the description to my Patreon where I post hour-long lessons. And of course, I post every Saturday. I hope to see you next Saturday. Thank you so much for watching. Stay creative and have a wonderful Easter weekend.